on 531 PI.
You're listening to Pacific Mornings on 531 PI. I'm William Terite. Brilliant to have your company as always. It is 12 minutes past 7 o'clock. Now, the United States and China has agreed to drastically roll back tariffs on each other's goods for an initial 90-day period in a surprise breakthrough that has de-escalated a punishing trade war and also punishing global markets. The announcement, which was made in a joint statement, comes after a weekend of marathon trade negotiations in Geneva, Switzerland by officials from the world's two largest economies, during which both sides touted substantial progress. Here to talk about that and much more is my favourite international relations expert, Jeffrey Miller. Very good morning to you, sir. Welcome in.
Good morning, William. Good to be back.
Look, what do you make of this agreement by the United States and China? It's a bit of a complete 360.
It is indeed, and Donald Trump, of course, touts himself as the deal maker, and that's what we've seen here. We've seen a deal. That's what he promised after the so-called Liberation Day on April the 2nd, when Donald Trump introduced all of these tariffs for countries all around the world. He promised that there would be some deals done and talks held, and that's what's happened. And we had a deal released last week with the United Kingdom, and now one just over the weekend with China. And we're seeing the United States step back from the brink after a month or more of chaos on the financial markets and international trade. What we've seen is that the tariffs have been dialed back. They haven't been scrapped at all. And if you'd said a few months ago that the United States would be imposing 30% tariffs on all goods from China, you would think, well, that's a pretty big move. And that's what we're back to. But it's better than 145%, which was the level of tariffs or import taxes that were imposed on Chinese goods until this deal was struck over the weekend. So the United States has agreed to lower its tariff from 145% to 30%. That's made up of 10% baseline tariffs and 20% as a punishment, supposedly for China not taking enough action on the manufacturing and trade of fentanyl, the fentanyl drug, which is causing a lot of harm. And in Donald Trump's view, China is the source of all evil on that front. So that's why it's 30%. In exchange, China is very generously imposing only a 10% import tax on US goods coming in to China. Remember, tariffs hurt your own consumers and your own domestic markets, really. So it's in China's interest to reduce the tariff on US goods to as low as it can make it, because it also needs a lot of the US goods for its own industrial base. If you think of various machinery and other goods that can be used in China's manufacturing processes. So it's better than where we were. And I think perhaps the best sign here is that the two parties are talking. The talks are very positive. Donald Trump is talking of a total reset. They're talking that he will have a chat with Xi Jinping later in the week. I think the tone is perhaps the real win here, as much as the substance of the deal, which is only in place for 90 days. So it's only going to be in place for 3 months until middle of August, and then everything will snap back to those 145% rates, or 125% in terms of the retaliatory tariff from China. But probably there will be some extension or some further deal done. But it means that there's a great panicking now on the part of exporters to get their product shipped to the United States within this 90-day window, because they don't know what's coming after that. So that's probably going to drive up the cost of shipping over the next few months from the United States, from China to the United States, and vice versa. So it's all very chaotic, but that's the story of the Donald Trump presidency, and we're still less than 3 months into his second term. It feels like a lot longer than that.
Yeah, certainly. And let's bring New Zealand into the equation just for a moment. This government, rightfully, some would argue, hasn't really been keen to rock the boat when it comes to its language or, wanting to talk down these tariffs. In fact, the finance minister just days ago put it pretty simply when she said it's like if we were to speak out against the United States, it'd be like throwing a ping pong ball at an elephant. Do you like the way, or do you approve of the way in which we have pursued this kind of tariff mess?
I think softly, softly is probably going to be the most effective approach. Some diplomatic moves behind the scenes. New Zealand's problem here is that it doesn't have the clout that others do, and there pretty much every country in the world, or at least a large number, were hit with these tariffs on Liberation Day on April the 2nd. But New Zealand's well behind in the queue when it comes to deal making. So we've seen the United Kingdom that they were chosen to do an early deal with the United States. China is going to be the big dogs really that have these deals done. New Zealand, it's in the back of the queue. New Zealand is somewhat fortunate though in that there's only the 10% baseline tariff really affecting the vast majority of exports. There's a separate 25% tariff on steel and aluminium that does affect some New Zealand exports because New Zealand has the Tiwai aluminium smelter, for example, that exports around 40 million New Zealand dollars worth of aluminium to the United States each year. But it's a relatively small amount of its production and a relatively small amount of New Zealand's overall exports, a very small amount. New Zealand doesn't export cars, and they've been subject to another separate 25% tariff. So virtually all of our goods going into the US are just subject to the 10% tariff. There was some talk early on that Donald Trump would introduce an agricultural or a tariff on agricultural imports to the United States, and that came out in one of his missives, I think, on his social media, but it didn't actually turn into a policy. So that came out, I think, at the start of March. There was talk of that, and I remember Todd McClay talking on that issue and saying that New Zealand would be talking to the United States to try and talk them out of it. But it didn't seem to actually materialize. So there isn't that separate extra tariff. We're simply facing these 10% baseline tariffs like most countries. But there are other countries that have got that were slapped with a higher tariff. European Union countries, for example, were hit with a 20% tariff. Now that was suspended for 3 months. Everyone's tariffs were suspended for 3 months until July the 8th. But that would then come back on after that if no deal is done. So it's more pressing if you're the likes of the EU or Vietnam, Cambodia. These were countries that were facing tariffs of up to 48, 49%. These countries are going to be very keen to get a deal done before that extension closes on July the 8th. New Zealand's somewhat fortunate in that New Zealand's original punishment, in a way, from Donald Trump was only that 10% tariff to start with. So we could be okay here. But I think that there are some things for New Zealand to think about here because this UK deal that was done, it's mainly at this stage affects cars and steel and aluminium. So the tariffs have been cut to zero on steel and aluminium from the United Kingdom. Cars, the tariff has been reduced to 10% for the first 100,000 cars exported from the United Kingdom to the United States. But there is talk that this would be expanded into a bigger deal over time, and that could see that 10% baseline tariff reduced. Now, the issue is that if the 10% tariff is reduced for a lot of different countries based on deal making on particular goods, this could put New Zealand at a competitive disadvantage. So New Zealand has to watch that. There was already something that was not so favorable to New Zealand in that UK deal, and that was that the United Kingdom is now able to export beef to the United States. It's a relatively small amount, 13,000 metric tons. But New Zealand, of course, is a big beef exporter to the United States. New Zealand has a quota of around 200,000 tons to the United States at a preferential rate. And if the likes of the United Kingdom are brought in as well, that's a competitor for New Zealand in terms of the US market. You can think of other goods as well, where New Zealand might be disadvantaged, things like wine. If Trump does a deal with the EU, for example, and if tariffs are cut on wine below that 10%, well, then New Zealand exporters are going to be at a disadvantage. And because New Zealand isn't able to get a meeting or a deal done with Trump just because of its size and it doesn't have the clout, then that could be a problem for New Zealand. But some of these things are still hypothetical. We simply don't know what's going to happen. You don't know what's going to happen from day to day under the Donald Trump presidency, let alone from week to week or month to month.
Indeed. Look, just very quickly on this one, Ukraine, of course, set to engage in direct talks perhaps with Russia this week in an effort to, well, some are hoping and pleading for a peace deal. Come on, it's been so long now since this invasion kicked off. I mean, are you expecting anything tangible from this or more of the same?
Look, more than 3 years of war now since Russia invaded Ukraine in February 2022. I think it's really, really good news that these talks look likely to take place in Istanbul on Thursday. They could be direct talks. We could even see Vladimir Putin head to Istanbul and meet Volodymyr Zelensky directly. Zelensky, the Ukrainian president, has challenged Vladimir Putin to meet him face to face. We desperately need more dialogue, diplomacy, de-escalation. We're going to get at least the dialogue on Thursday if this pans out. And we desperately need an end to this war. There have been hundreds of thousands of Ukrainian and Russian soldiers killed or injured in this war. Countless civilians as well have been displaced or have been killed or injured themselves. It's been absolutely destructive over the past 3 years, and it's consumed a huge amount of the world's attention, including New Zealand's, and we desperately need a resolution to this war. So we will see. And this is, again, Trump diplomacy in action. Donald Trump told Volodymyr Zelensky he should accept the invitation to have these talks in Istanbul. Remember, that was an invitation put forward by Vladimir Putin. He said that there should be these direct talks on Thursday in response to a call for a 30-day ceasefire by European leaders. And Vladimir Putin essentially ignored that bit and said, well, let's have direct talks in Istanbul on Thursday instead. And Trump said, well, we should do that. And I think that is good. I think we desperately need that dialogue, that conversation. You're not going to get an end to the war without talking. And as Winston Churchill said way back when, jaw is better than war. So in other words, talking's better than fighting.
Couldn't agree more. Hey, look, finally, now Anthony Albanese, what a win for him. And of course, they're still over there kind of assessing just how big of a win, frankly. Now, he announced his refreshed cabinet. Penny Wong will retain foreign affairs. And to the credit of Penny Wong, she has been highly visible in the Pacific region under the last iteration of the Albanese government. In terms of what we can expect foreign policy-wise out of Albo's second term, what do you expect for the Pacific? More of the same?
Indeed, more of the same continuity, and it's not a bad thing. And the fact that Anthony Albanese is keeping his cabinet when it comes to foreign affairs is a good thing. Penny Wong in foreign affairs, Richard Marles in defence, Pat Conroy as the Minister for the Pacific, and that means they're going to be hitting the ground running. And I think if you're a Pacific state, you'll be pleased about that. That there is some continuity. You know who you're dealing with. You know the strategy, which essentially is more attention, more money, more development, more aid into the Pacific. I think there's always room for more because the amount of aid that Australia is putting out there, it's going up, but not quite at the rate of inflation at the moment. And of course, there's a lot of money now going into defence budgets all around the world, not just in Australia, but there's a temptation at the moment from a lot of countries to cut foreign aid and put that money into defence. That's the wrong decision in my view for countries that are taking that approach. Australia, I don't think is doing that yet, but there are always choices to be made with government spending, and when you're spending on one thing, you're not spending on another. So we're going to see, I think, more of the same overall from the Albanese government, from his Labor. From his Labor government. What we will see is also a continuation of the move to bid for COP31, and that was one of Anthony Albanese's centerpiece proposals to host COP31 next year in partnership with a Pacific state, which is quite an innovative proposal and a popular one, no doubt, in the Pacific. And Australia is competing with Turkey for the rights to hold that UN Environmental Summit COP31 next year. And so that will be one of the early signs in a way to see just how successful Albanese will be with his Pacific strategy, because that will be a big event. Remember, that's one of these big summits that bring a lot of world leaders, and it will bring these world leaders to Australia if Anthony Albanese is successful, but also to the Pacific, and they'll be able to see then the front lines of climate change with their own eyes. I think that wouldn't be a bad thing. Because while the Pacific is a big priority focus for Australia and New Zealand, for countries that are much further afield, it's more in the abstract. They see the Pacific on the map, and they do understand the importance of the Pacific, particularly in the context of the strategic competition between the US and China. But they probably don't have that direct experience in the same way that the likes of Australia and New Zealand typically do, and certainly with the foreign ministers, whether it's Winston Peters in New Zealand or Penny Wong from Australia. They've been crisscrossing the Pacific over the last couple of years, and that was really Penny Wong's original strategy, was to get out there and visit as many Pacific states as she could. Winston Peters followed that strategy as well. So it will be interesting to see how things go under the second term of the Labour government in Australia.
Couldn't agree more. Hey, thank you as always for your expertise. That is international relations expert Jeffrey Miller. You have a good rest of your day, eh?
Hey, you too, William. Thanks again.
You're listening